Welcome to Storytime. Enjoy with me. Frozen Pizza by Antoinette Moses.
"And this is your room." Mrs. Stonehouse opened the door. The young man swallowed in amazement. There were dozens of painted rabbits all over the walls. There were white rabbits, black rabbits, and brown rabbits. There were even rabbits painted on the bed itself and on the cushions on the bed. "It was the children's room when they were small," said Mrs. Stonehouse. "I hope you don't mind, but you said that you wanted a room with a desk, and this is the only room we have with a desk in it. It's nice and clean, though. I dusted it only this morning." "No," said the young man. "I don't mind. It's fine. I expect that I'll soon get used to the rabbits." "I did them myself," said Mrs. Stonehouse, who always admired her own work. "I painted them with a stencil." "I'm sorry," said the young man. "I don't know that word. With a what?" "A stencil," replied Mrs. Stonehouse. "You buy them at art shops." She smiled. The young man could see that she was very proud of her work. "It's like a thick piece of paper with shapes cut out, and you stick it on the wall and paint inside the shapes. You can stencil all kinds of designs. Clever, isn't it?" The young man thought it sounded like something he used to do at his nursery school. He'd been about 4 years old at the time. He thought it was a rather strange thing for a grown-up woman to do, but he was too polite to say so. "Well," said Mrs. Stonehouse, "I expect that you'll want to unpack your things. I'll leave you in peace." The young man looked around the room and wondered whether he had made a mistake. Perhaps he should have stayed at the university and not chosen to have a room in the town. But he had thought that living in a family would help him to improve his English. It was already quite good enough, in fact, for him to have won a place at the university to study science. He had a degree in his own country, but he wanted to carry out some additional research in England. This was not what he had expected. He had expected a family of university people like his own family, who sat round the table talking and arguing at all times of the day and night. Although Mrs. Stonehouse had said that she had 2 teenage children, the house was surprisingly tidy for a family with children. His own home, he realized, was always untidy. Every room was filled with books and piles of paper that threatened to fall down onto the floor whenever someone banged a door. This house was not at all like that. One of the first things he had noticed was that the entrance hall had been quite empty. There was just a small table with a telephone on it and a neat pad of paper with a pen beside it. Perhaps the kitchen would be more like his home, he thought. The young man unpacked his clothes and put them away in the wardrobe. Then he piled his books on the desk, as there was no bookcase in the room. He was hungry. He looked at his watch. It was 7 o'clock. He wondered what time the family had dinner. Mrs. Stonehouse still seemed to be the only person in the house. He walked downstairs and knocked on the door of the front room. He could hear sounds of laughter inside. "Come in!" called Mrs. Stonehouse. The room was very pink, and there were bows and little white baskets painted on the walls. He supposed that Mrs. Stonehouse had done these too, with a stencil. He thought that the room looked horrible, and imagined how his mother would laugh if she saw it. Mrs. Stonehouse was watching television. There was a quiz show of some kind. 2 rows of contestants faced each other. They laughed whenever the man asking the questions said anything, and they all clapped every time one of the contestants said anything. They reminded him of seals in the zoo. There were similar television shows in his country, but his family never watched them. They thought they were very stupid. "Is there something you want?" asked Mrs. Stonehouse, without looking up from the television. "I'm sorry," said the young man. "I just wondered what time you had dinner." Mrs. Stonehouse laughed. She had a strange laugh, like the bird-like sound of a mobile phone. "We don't have dinner. We're all so busy. We just eat and run." The young man thought that was a strange thing to say, when all she seemed to do was sit and watch television. "Come with me," she told the young man. "I'll show you the kitchen." Mrs. Stonehouse led him into the room at the end of the hall. It was bright, very bright. The young man thought it might look better through sunglasses. The walls were yellow, the ceiling was yellow, and the cupboards were yellow, bright yellow. It was like walking into the inside of a lemon, and there were indeed several lemons in the kitchen, and oranges and apples and bunches of grapes, all stenciled over the walls and the cupboards. "It's, brilliant," he said. He was trying to say that it was bright without saying how horrible he thought it was. But Mrs. Stonehouse thought that he meant that it was very clever, and she was pleased. She liked her work to be admired. The young man looked round the room. Something was wrong. "Excuse me," he asked. "Where is the fridge?" Mrs. Stonehouse laughed again. "It's here," she said, opening a cupboard door. "And the freezer is hidden here." The young man could not understand why anyone would want to hide a fridge or a freezer. He wondered where Mrs. Stonehouse had hidden the cooker. What a strange kitchen this was, he thought. The only thing he recognized was the sink. It was a big, old-fashioned white sink, like his grandmother had at her farm. He wondered why Mrs. Stonehouse did not have a nice new sink like his mother. "It's a big sink," he said. "Yes," Mrs. Stonehouse replied. "It's wonderful. I've been wanting a sink like this for years. It's a copy of an antique sink, you know. They're very fashionable at the moment." "Oh," said the young man. He felt more and more confused. "And the cooker?" he asked. He couldn't see how you could hide a cooker in a cupboard, but in this house anything seemed possible. "Oh, we don't have a cooker," Mrs. Stonehouse smiled. "We'd never use it anyway. But here's the electric kettle, and here's the sandwich-making machine, and this is the microwave." "I see," said the young man. "Do they live on sandwiches?" he wondered. "But where do you cook?" He could see a shelf of big, colourful cookery books on one wall. "The poor boy," thought Mrs. Stonehouse. "I suppose that in his country they don't have very much. I suppose that the women stay at home and cook simple food, like they did here in England before I was born. I expect that he feels that he's very lucky to be able to stay in a house like this." "Oh, I don't cook," she laughed. "We're a very modern family. We don't waste our time on things like that, and I've never been one for cookery. I love reading cookery books, of course," she added, "but that's different."
To be continued.